Hey, gun people. This is Newt explaining how the courts are out of control and taking and seizing powers that they weren't intended to have and that they shouldn't have. But at one point, I think it particularly applies to police as well. Here we go.
Read the Declaration of Independence. A very large number of its specific charges against Great Britain involve dictatorial judges. The fact is the Founding Fathers deeply distrusted judges and thought that the lawyer class was dangerous and that you could not give them unbridled power.
So even at the start of the country, they knew lawyers were bad news.
Or they would undermine and destroy free society. Now, this is not some marginal position. Thomas Jefferson, asked about judicial supremacy, said, that is an absurdity. That would be an oligarchy. And it's doubly dangerous because, you see, if judges think that they are unchallengeable.
This is where he gets into this exactly applies to police. Police are unchallengeable. They aren't held accountable. They're given immunity, just like judges. And they know that they can do whatever they want. So they have learned to expect power, receive power, abuse power, keep power, and no one challenges it. This is why our police are out of control today.
It's doubly dangerous because, you see, if judges think that they are unchallengeable, they are inevitably corrupted. Corrupted in a moral sense. I don't mean taking money.
When people say corrupt cops, they automatically think they're on the take. And this is what he's talking about. Morally corrupt because they're so obsessed with their power and unaccountability that they are out of control. They ignore the Constitution. They ignore rules and laws. And they definitely ignore the rights of the American people. The police today are not the police of 20, 30 years ago.
But I mean in a sense of arrogance, in a sense of imposing on the rest of us. Lord Acton warned in the 19th century that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Notice he dropped the word tends. And the courts in the last 53 years have proven that Lord Acton's right. Because with each passing decade, the judges have become more hostile to the American tradition. They now openly talk about using foreign sources of information because, after all, the American Constitution is so old and so antiquated. A justice who believes that shouldn't be serving on the American bench. One of the major impediments and threats to democracy today is the very behavior of the law schools, which teach a usurpation of power in a way that is utterly unsustainable. Founding Fathers designed our Constitution based on Montesquieu's concept of the balance of power. We're supposed to have three co-equal branches. There can be no supremacy if there are three co-equal branches, by definition.
This is the most confusing or kind of challenging part of the Constitution, because the executive branch is the sword, legislative branch is the money, and the judicial branch is opinions. The judicial branch doesn't have an army to enforce their rulings, and Congress doesn't have an army to force their rulings. That all falls under the president, the executive branch.
Otherwise, you'd have a superior branch and two inferior branches. But it's worse than that. If you read Hamilton in the Federalist Papers, he says the courts couldn't possibly take on the legislative and executive branch because they would inevitably lose. Jefferson is the most clear example of taking on the judiciary. In the Judicial Reform Act of 1802, the Jeffersonians eliminated 18 out of 35 federal judges. Didn't impeach them, just abolished their offices, told them to go home. Jackson, in tackling the Bank of the United States, which he said was a overly centralized form of power, think of it as the earlier Bernanke. Well, the Supreme Court has said that it's constitutional. He said, fine, that's their opinion. He said, I have a different opinion.
Amen.
The president, they're a court. They get their opinion in court. I get my opinion in the White House. Lincoln spends a large section of his first inaugural address explaining why the Dred Scott decision may be the law of the case, but cannot be the law of the land. And Lincoln refuses to enforce the Dred Scott decision while he's president, period. So people who come in and say, oh, as Nancy Pelosi once said, if the court speaks, it's as though God has spoken. Now, to be fair, having somebody from her branch of the party recognize God is an important step in the right direction. And the question of national security, in the last few years, the courts, I think, have become virtually out of touch with reality. The idea that the courts are now going to take on responsibility for defending the United States is a clear and fundamental violation of the Constitution and a fundamental violation of the executive branch's power, and the Congress should pass a law repudiating every interference of the courts in national security issues and returning them to the Congress and the President where they rightly belong. In 1942, a group of German saboteurs were landed in Florida and Long Island. They were all picked up within 2 weeks. Roosevelt brought in his Attorney General and said, they will be tried in a military court, they will be executed, it should happen within 3 weeks, and tell the Supreme Court if they issue a writ of habeas corpus, I will not honor it, and therefore they should not issue it. I am the commander-in-chief in wartime, they aren't.
Wow.
Congress has the power to limit the appeals, as I mentioned earlier. Congress can cut budgets. Congress can say, all right, in the future, the Ninth Circuit can meet, but it will have no clerks. By the way, we aren't going to pay the electric bill for 2 years, and since you seem to be rendering justice in the dark, you don't seem to need your law library either. This is, by the way, I am paraphrasing Hamilton in the Federalist Papers, in which he is defending, he says flatly, the judiciary is the weakest of the three branches. I mean, this modern model is just totally opposite the American tradition.
I thought that was very interesting. The whole country is turned upside down between the courts and lawyers thinking they don't have to listen to the Constitution, cops and police thinking they're accountable to nobody and they don't have to listen to the Constitution. Nobody gives them consequences. De facto, they're right. All right, just thought I'd share. Y'all have a good one.